Phoenix Splash TV. I get this question a lot. Why does today's music suck? To answer this question, we have to define a lot of terms that many people use incorrectly. First, let's talk about pop music. Many people confuse pop music for a genre itself, but pop music is actually whatever music is popular at the time. The Beatles were considered pop music. Nirvana was considered pop music, just as much as Lil Wayne and Beyonce are considered pop music today. While there are some song genres that dominate the charts, a song with a foreign genre can suddenly pop up if their sales come through. Today, R&B and hip-hop dominate, but one year a heavy metal band could surprise everyone and just take that #1 spot. Maximum the Hormone did it in Japan, and for that time, that music would be considered pop. But let's define mainstream. Mainstream is a little bit different. You might get people that say, oh, that sounds very mainstream. They're referring to mirror songs, songs that latch on to whatever is popular at the time and reuse their musical motifs or write in the same genre. If the year is 1968 and you're making psychedelic rock and roll like Jimi Hendrix and slightly changing his guitar riffs, then the music you are making is mainstream. Most people who listen to it will probably like it due to the fact that it sounds like what's popular. It's why we see many independent hip-hop artists right now. Hip-hop and R&B are pretty popular, so chances are, if you compose within that song genre, you'll be somewhat praised. But what is good music composition? Of course, this is all up to opinion, but I'm going to share my philosophy of what good music composition is. Throughout time, there have been 3 types of successful composers. Type 1 is the composer who challenges normal approaches to music. These are the experimental musicians who often break rules and discover new genres that we couldn't even imagine. Type 2 composer is the composer that writes the simplest. The melodies are catchy, the song structure is not too complicated, and everyone understands it and it appeals to everyone while at the same time expanding their respective genre, and sometimes even being original. And then there's Type 3. Type 3 is a composer who listens to what's popular and rehashes its musical ideas in a way to where he doesn't get sued. If you're in a debate and you're making a point of, well, everyone does that in their song nowadays, so it's okay, then you're probably defending a Type 3 composer. Now, composers are very complicated, but I find that these 3 types best define all of them. Of course, some composers can be in more than one group. Kurt Cobain is probably the best example. He challenged music and broke the rules while at the same time being catchy and simple. There can also be composers who started out as Type 2 and then slowly transform to a Type 3 composer. And then there's composers that can fit every type all at the same time. Really bizarre. The composers I acknowledge as good composers are typically Type 1 and Type 2 composers, though I typically place composers who are Type 1 on a higher pedestal. In fact, most music enthusiasts will agree with that. Type 3 composers are usually in it for the money and the fame, and are usually only interested in manipulating their listeners rather than making a good song. Type 3 composers are responsible for killing music genres. If you're watching this video, you're probably into Type 2 composers, the simple composer, or Type 1, the complex rule breaker. If we look at what's popular in the US, which type of composers are the most successful? The answer, in most music eras, the Type 2 composer will always win. Now, why is this? The answer is, it's that most people who love music, or at least buy it, aren't exactly complex listeners or musicians themselves. They want something they could sing along to or at least hum and dance to. For a song to achieve those goals, it has to be catchy and repetitive. These are traits that the full-blooded Type 1 composers don't want to be. They want to challenge ears and make people think rather than being an accompaniment to a dance party. But once in a while, a Type 1 composer will be very successful. Pink Floyd's The Wall was the best-selling album in 1980. Jimi Hendrix in 1968 had the #1 album as well. And whether you like them or not, Linkin Park, which I consider a Type 1 composer, had the best album in the year in 2001. Breaking boundaries while having the best-selling album is probably the greatest achievement a composer could ask for. But what about the Type 3 composer? How well does he do on charts? To my surprise, the Type 3 composers only do best in the single sales rather than album sales. I even find more Type 1 composers on greatest albums than I do Type 3, and I find this to be pretty interesting. Type 1 composers will be the most innovative. If we look at the band Dead Sea, who I consider Type 1 composers, many of the bands that followed in their footsteps were more successful than they were, and I considered bands like Good Charlotte and My Chemical Romance as Type 2 composers. But we can even go back further in time and compare two Baroque musicians. Now, Bach is a very complex composer who innovated many things, but for the sake of this video, let's call him a Type 2 composer, a simple composer, because I actually do feel that he is, by heart, a Type 2 composer. If you don't believe me, take any of his songs and show it to a casual listener, and most people will say that it sounds nice. Though Bach was a master of counterpoint, the melodies were never overly complex, and you can hum and sing many of them. Some are even catchy, much like a Type 2 composer would write. Now, most people know who Bach is, and many people consider him the king of music. But during the time that he was composing, there was another composer who was not writing so catchy melodies, and his name was Jean-Philippe Rameau. And he is without a doubt a Type 1 composer. I mean, just try humming this. Both of them wrote music at the same time, but only Bach was praised and held in high regard, while Rameau was criticized and even attacked for innovating such melody styles. So even back then, people preferred simple melodies over overly complex ones. Now, Type 1 and Type 2 composers have been fighting since music began, with Type 2 composers usually winning out. The only era that I can think of where Type 1 composers were dominant was an era in music known as the Romantic era, where music standards were at an all-time high and the popular thing to do was to be innovative. As a result, complex structures and composition dominated very heavily, and it produced some of mankind's greatest compositions. But to answer that age-old question, does today's music suck? I don't entirely think so. The three types of composers will always exist. Type 1 composers will be innovative. The Type 2 composers will build on the work of Type 1 composers and rework it to appeal to everyone. And Type 3 composers will make people get tired of that innovative sound, and thus the Type 1 composers will get back to work. And that is what I think is happening anyway. I will admit that the popular genres have not changed all that much at all. What people don't see is the many innovations within the Type 1 composers, simply because they are not advertised as well as Type 2 and Type 3. Generally, when people complain about today's music, they typically enjoy a music genre that was popular in a previous period of time. But many of those genres of music are still being produced by many artists today. They're just not being shoved in your face. And many music today is still trying to be innovative. You just have to go and find them. I will admit though, some music genres like country and hip hop are trying desperately to stay on the charts and are containing more and more Type 3 composers as a result. This could be a bad move and could effectively kill their respective genres.
No one else can be.
Yeah, because once you be you, who could be you but you?
Right.
That's what's wrong right now. Everybody trying to rap the same style with the, I don't know who created it, if it was Future or Migos, but all them niggas sound the same.
I think some of the greatest songwriters of all time are country artists, Dolly Parton, Willie Nelson, you know? And if you're writing honestly, that is art, and I would never bash that. The problem is, with a lot of modern country music, what is called stadium country music, the sort of Keith Urban brand of country music, is that it is not honest. It is the exact opposite of honest. Where instead of people actually telling their stories, you got a bunch of millionaire metrosexuals who've never done a hard day's work in their life, but they figured out the words and the phrases they can use to pander to their audience, and they list the same words and phrases off sort of Mad Lib style in every song, raking in millions of dollars from actual working class people. You know the words, you know the phrases like a dirt road, a cold beer, a blue jeans, a red pickup, a rural noun, simple adjective.
Well, that is my theory on how popular music works. Some people ask me to do a video on why today's music suck, and when they tell me this, I usually just think about the composer triangle. Type 1 and Type 2 composers will always be composing, so if you're a music enthusiast, chances are you're going to like what they're cooking. I honestly feel like there's a big amateur scene in composition, and many genres are being invented as we speak. But hey, if you like this video, leave a like and share it with a buddy or complete stranger. Also, what are some Type 1 and Type 2 and even Type 3 composers that you can think of? And also, what type of composer do you think I am? Leave it all in the comments below. This is Josh the Music Man, signing off.